Australia is a country in Oceania, and it's quite clear that Australia is the country that covers the entirety of the island of Australia, although this wasn't always the case. And back when there were no people of European descent and there were just Aboriginal people living there, there was no concept of this Australia as a nation that covered the entirety of the island, and instead there were many different peoples with different languages and customs that were spread across the island. One of these was called the Murrawarri. They roamed over a territory that today sits between the modern states of Queensland and New South Wales, and had been doing so for tens of thousands of years when, in 1770, the British explorer James Cook first caught sight of that part of Australia. Of course, the Dutch had beaten him to it on the other side by over a century. Cook decided to claim the entire island for Great Britain, even though he had only seen a very small proportion of it. And it was only in 1845 actually that the explorer Thomas Mitchell and his son made contact with the Murrawari people. And by 1850 there were already settlers or colonizers taking over large pieces of land, which led to conflict with the Murrawari people who were already there, as the settlers attacked them and committed many massacres against the people there. After this initial land grabbing phase, the relations between the Aboriginal people and the newcomers did improve somewhat, and the relations were mainly peaceable. However, the British Crown had never actually formally declared war on the Murrawari people, nor taken their land, and there was no kind of treaty between the Murrawari people and the British or the subsequent Australian government when its colonies voted to become a federation by referendum in 1901. Nor were there any in the following century. While this video is about to take a time jump of around a century, if you go to today's video sponsor, which is MagellanTV, then you can find out more about Australia's history, especially in one documentary I particularly liked, which is called The Story of Australia. And as many of you will know, the English word history is etymologically related to the word story. And indeed, this documentary is really clever in what it does, in that it shows lots of the stories of individuals in Australia and connects them to the broader narrative of Australian history, because ultimately history is simply the stories of those people that lived through it. Now, it doesn't just talk about the European arrival with the British in Botany Bay, but in fact goes back much further and has a whole section in the first episode about the Aboriginal people and their ancestors who hunted megafauna when they still lived on Australia. That makes this documentary really good watching alongside this video, as it shows an angle on the ancestors of people like the Murrawari who have been in Australia for an incredibly long time. Now, you can find this documentary and many others, in fact there are around 3,000 on history, new ones being added each week, if you follow the link in the description, which is try.magellantv.com/historywithhilbert, and there you can find out an awful lot more about Australia and its history. In 2013, a group called the People's Council of the Murrawari decided to put this to the test. They said when Captain Cook arrived here in 1770, he said he was claiming the continent in the name of the Crown. But on what legal grounds did he take our land? They took this further and decided to draft a letter which they sent to both the Australian government and also to the head of the government of Australia, which technically is still Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom and indeed of Australia. And in it they asked three things. They asked for any treaties between the Murrawari people and Great Britain. They asked for a deed of cession showing the Murrawari to have handed over their sovereignty of the land, or of documents providing evidence for a declaration of war between Great Britain and the Murrawari people. They sent this away on the 30th of March 2013 with a deadline set at the 8th of May 2013. And when they didn't hear anything back by this deadline, they declared the Murrawarri Republic an independent state in the east of Australia, saying the Murrawarri Republic to be a continued free and independent state in line with international law and covenants. Basically, their argument was that there had never been a formal declaration that the Murrawari people had made to either the Australian or the British authorities saying that they had indeed signed up to be a part of Australia. They also had not been conquered by any government, nor had they given up their land in any such treaty, and so they claimed they were continuing on their independence, which they had held for tens of thousands of years, and this was simply making it formal. Now, they also appealed to the UN to get international recognition for their new state. They also created a police force for inside, and they also started to make the basic outline of government inside the new Murrawarri Republic. Now, they also said that today is a historic moment. The Murrawarri Republic now has a formal interim government that is responsible for the governance of the Republic. This day is very significant as it begins to free the Murrawarri peoples from the tyranny of our colonial oppressors. So the question is, how will Australia respond? Did they A, outright recognise the independence of this new Murrawarri Republic and declare it to be the second official nation on the island of Australia? Did they B, rally the soldiers? Did they get them ready, send them in, all guns blazing, shoot down the last of these deserters and fly high the flag of Australia on this conquered soil? Or did they C, do nothing? So make your predictions, let me know in the comments below which one did you think it was. The answer is coming, it's C. The Australian government didn't do anything. They didn't respond, they didn't internationally recognise it, nor did they send in the troops. And neither did the United Nations, and they still go unrecognised today. A reporter from the newspaper Time commented that there are no constitutional means available for the establishment of separate political communities in Australia, and that was why the Attorney General's Office of Australia hadn't responded to the declaration of the continued independence that the Murrawarri Republic had declared. So, are there any other cases in Australia where others have tried to do the same, as there are so many different Aboriginal groups that were there? Well, there kind of are. One example from 1979 is the legal challenge put forward by the barrister Paul Coe, a member of the Wiradjuri people, who also brought forward an argument similar to the one of the Murrawarri Republic, in that they had never formally given over their land to the British administration. And in the court case that became known as Coe versus Commonwealth, he argued that this was the case for many of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. However, ultimately this proved unsuccessful. Part of the problem for the Australian government is that by granting one of these requests, they would be opening a huge can of worms for themselves, given that by giving one, they would also then be acknowledging the claims of many of the other Aboriginal groups that are also in Australia. This is also a problem in the Murrawarri Republic, for example, as there are far more people who are descended from the European settlers that came there than are actually members of the Murrawarri people itself. And while those members of the Murrawarri Republic are more likely to support the idea of an independent state, the majority, who are the descendants of the Europeans that came there, are far less likely to, and don't believe that leaving Australia as a country would do any good for the region. Clearly, finding a solution that respects both the historic claims and rights of Aboriginal people, as well as that works with the modern multi-ethnic state of Australia, has proven incredibly difficult. One step that was taken in 1982, however, was one by a Torres Islander called Eddie Mabo, who challenged the concept of terra nullius, which was something that the British and Australian authorities had used to claim that the land hadn't actually been owned by any of the Aboriginal peoples before, and could therefore be claimed by James Cook for Britain and later for Australia. This came to a head when Eddie Mabo, who had been born in the Torres Strait Islands, tried to return to his place of birth and was refused entry to the islands, despite the fact that his family had lived there for thousands of years. In 1992, he unfortunately died of cancer, but he and his team won the legal case and had terra nullius overturned, leading to the incorporation of the Native Title Act into the nation's legislation, which stated that membership of the Indigenous people depends on biological descent from the Indigenous people and on mutual recognition of a particular person's membership by that person and by the elders or other persons enjoying traditional authority among those people, and ensured that they could could use the land that had been used by their ancestors and for generations before that. And today, around 18% of Australian territory, which is around 1.3 million kilometres squared, has indeed been claimed under this Native Title Act and can be used by people whose descendants had been on the land for thousands or tens of thousands of years. The decision led to more Aboriginal people realising that they might use the Australian legal system to their own advantage and to claim areas of historic land for their own use and habitation. And indeed, there are several areas in Australia where one might expect in the future to see more of these land claims coming about, particularly in the Northern Territories, as well as you've got the Murrawarri Republic on there and some other areas too. And only time will tell, and it seems like the Murrawarri Republic's declaration, while really on the ground nothing has changed and it hasn't been internationally recognised, it did have an impact. And in fact, some 27 Aboriginal nations requested to get a draft of the Murrawarri Republic's Declaration for Independence, perhaps thinking to do the same in the future if they met with success. And there's no telling what will happen in the future, but for now, that is as it stands. I'll finish with a quote from a spokesperson from the Murrawarri Republic who said, "Our people are mature and intelligent. We're not picking up guns or throwing Molotov cocktails. We've studied our conquerors' laws, proven how they've broken them, and are now turning those laws against them. We will force an issue the Australian government doesn't want to debate." However, I would quite like to debate this, so do let me know in the comments below, what do you think about the Murrawarri Republic? I think they kind of have a point. If they have never been conquered, they have never signed a treaty that says they are giving up the land, then potentially you could indeed claim that that land is still theirs. But of course, we are living in the 21st century, and Australia now is very different to the Australia of 150 years ago when those European settlers first arrived. And there is also the point that it would open up a huge can of worms for the rest of Australia where things really aren't that clear cut. Let me know in the comments below, what are your honest opinions about this? I would love to see a lively debate in the comment section on this, and I look forward to seeing your responses there. But for the meantime, I have been Hilbert. Thank you to my awesome patrons for subscribing and for helping me out with making this content, and all of you for watching my videos. All the best.